writing was really invented many times in history. For example, we've got the two earliest, which is Indus Valley and the Sumerians. This early writing is obviously one of the things that makes people think that they might have had a common origin, and it's possible. We don't even know what the Indus Valley writing is or if it's really a form of writing, but I will include it because it looks like a form of writing. Now, we also have ancient Egypt, which is also amongst some of the earliest writing in history. And it's completely unique to the Sumerian and the Indus Valley. But you will notice that if you look at this line here, it's almost like a straight line of language to language to language from Africa, Sumeria, India, and China. It's almost like a straight line. This is what made people guess that writing must have started in one of these places and spread throughout. And of course, some people call the cradle of civilization the Middle East because Sumeria is one of those places that reaches first. Now, there's many things that fight back at that. Like, of course, there's areas that are found in Turkey which predate some of the Sumerian buildings and all kinds of things around the globe. But the other two writing systems is the Maya script, and then there is the Rongo, which is made in 400 AD, at least around that time. And it's made by the Polynesians. As you can see, it's much closer to South America than it is to Australia, but it's part of the Polynesian islands. And so by 400 AD, we know that the Polynesians had spread so close to South America that there's no reason to believe that the Polynesians didn't reach America at about this same time, even though we haven't found evidence that they reached at this specific time, but they did reach earlier than anybody else who came from the western side of the world. But remember also that the Polynesians were another really unknown people, at least the Polynesians that lived in the islands, not the ones who lived like close to China, but the Polynesians who lived by the islands next to Australia, Vanuatu and them. Those ones were themselves a lost civilization in the sense that people weren't aware that there was such a thing. If you read Middle Eastern texts, you read European texts, Asian texts, African texts, there's no writing about these islands at all until much later. The oldest writings from Egypt are not found in Lower Egypt as suspected by some people because they believe that the ancient Egyptian language might have come from Sumerians or somewhere in the Fertile Crescent. And the reason why this is shocking is because it seems to come more from Nubia. Remember, a lot of that area would be more Nubia than Egypt. And so to find it directly in Nubia is interesting. And not to overstate the point, but remember, this is the same with the little thing of Menes that was discovered. Though I have seen some people make claims about Sumeria and how Sumeria invented Egypt or whatever the hell, that still is something that's considered a myth or just random information. The real thing is that Egypt seems to be completely independent, even though it had access to Sumeria. And we know because of some things that we will point out. But I want to look at this Wikipedia article that talks about the connections and why is it that they make the connection much stronger than what it is, especially in this time period. Remember, the writings of ancient Egypt are mainly Nubian in terms of location. So in this early time. And of course, there's some of those other Roman writers who said the Nubians seem to be more familiar with the writing than most Egyptians are. So it says Egypt Mesopotamia relations were the relations between the civilizations of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia in the Middle East. They seem to have developed from the 4th millennium BC, starting in the Uruk period from Mesopotamia, and half a millennium younger Gerasian culture of prehistoric Egypt, and constitutionally constituted a largely one-way body of influence from Mesopotamia into Egypt. Now, this again is a guess. It's not a real thing. Now, it is true that most of the stuff that has been found in Egypt and not Sumeria. But, let's first just start there. And of course, you can see the direction they put there, which starts off with some people from Asia moving into Egypt, and then you see this long chain of thing. And the reason why they do that is because there seems to be some influence in Ethiopia and other place, and the only way to justify that is to make them take this long route. All of this is hypothetical, by the way. None of it is 100% true. We have no idea how things got there. Maybe hypothetical is not the best word. Let's say speculative. Prior to a specific Mesopotamian influence, there had already been a long-standing influence from West Asia into Egypt, North Africa, and even into some parts of the Horn of Africa and the Sahel in the form of the Neolithic Revolution, which from circa 9000 BCE diffused advanced agricultural practices and technology, gene flow, certain animals and crops, and the likely spread of Proto-Afroasiatic language into the region. So we've got a couple problems here. One, most Egyptologists think that Proto-Afroasiatic came from Africa, not from outside of Africa. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is we don't see a one-way direction into Africa. We see a movement of back and forth from Africa and this region rather than this one directional thing that they're trying to sell. And then, not to mention that not everything was spread evenly. North Africa and Egypt are really not the same if you look at the civilizations and how they look. And to be honest, I believe that Egypt being seen as a North African civilization, I mean, they're literally in the north, but being seen as a North African extension is true bias. I mean, if you you look clearly, it's in East Africa, and the kingdoms that are closest to it are other East African countries. In fact, the countries that are mostly mentioned outside of Egypt that are not in Asia are East African countries. It's Sudan, it's Ethiopia, it's the rest of these regions, and even possibly Chad was mentioned, but you don't really hear about faraway lands like Tunisia or anything like that. So to make it sound like it's this one big chain is not right. Now, again, I'm not one of these people who disbelieves that Asians can move. Obviously, Asians did move. And of course, I showed you that line, which still leaves a room for people moving from one place to the other, even as far as China, and perhaps even though not racially affecting it that much, but culturally affecting it just a little bit. That's possible, but that's possible for Egypt too. Okay, so we were reading, it said Proto-Afroasiatic language into the region, with Semitic languages being introduced via the Arabian Peninsula and Levant into the Horn of Africa and North Africa, respectively, after 1000 BCE. Oh, good, they just reminded me. Sumerians, remember, don't speak Afroasiatic at all. They don't speak a lick of Afroasiatic. We don't see them speak it until the Akkadians come over 1,000 years later, thousands of years later. And when they come in, they're clearly a different civilization, though they start to copy the stuff that the Sumerians are doing. And another thing is, Why did they bring only one Semitic language? If we go to the Semitic regions, if we go to Asia, there's a whole bunch of languages that stem from different things. We're talking about Elam, we're talking about Uruk, we're talking about Sumeria, we're talking about all these places that are around here. We're talking about Iran. They have different languages, but for some reason, the only language that spreads is one that cannot be found in those regions. Now, here's the part where it's correct when they say Mesopotamian influence can be seen in visual arts of Egypt, in architecture, in technology, weaponry, in important products, religious imagery, in agriculture and livestock, in genetic input, and also in the likely transfer of writing from Sumeria to Egypt. Okay, so a few of those are correct. So visual arts, we've seen some visual art that was clearly made by Sumerian hands, but we don't see them again. We see them like once or twice, and then it's over, showing you that it was more of a trade thing, but it wasn't something that really affected the culture. We'll come back to the other ones, but let's first just look at these Sumerian type things that were found in Egypt. Now, okay, fine. Let's say this is a Sumerian king. Let's say it's not an Egyptian and it's a Sumerian king. Does this look like Egypt to you? Like the rest of Egypt as it goes on? Do you see anything close to that in the rest of its history? I'll get back to what they were saying about the other claims, but let's start with the art thing. There was generally a high level of trade between ancient Egypt and the Near East. Uh, I don't know. Throughout the pre-dynastic period of Egypt during the Naqada II, 3600 and 3350 BCE, and Naqada III, 3350 to 2950 BCE, phases, these were contemporary with the late Uruk. Now, they're trying to draw a similarity here. Though there were trade with Asia, there is no reason to believe that it went as far as Uruk. And Jemdet Nasser, or the connection they're trying to make is they happened at the same time, therefore they were trading, but there's not really that much evidence. The main period of cultural influence, particularly consisting in the transfer of Mesopotamian imagery, symbols, and technology to Egypt, is considered to have lasted about 250 years during the Naqada II to the Dynasty I periods. Okay, so again, look at the art from the side. This art right here does not represent anything about Egypt as it went on further. I do believe that sure, it must have been something from Asia, but that does not change the fact that it was probably just a thing that came from far away. And of course, I believe the Sumerians did trade. Now, to believe that they came all the way there and they were just chilling in Egypt, I don't know. This was what I was talking about, though, in the beginning. What they don't mention is Nubia, and they don't mention how close it was to Egypt, and why would a place as far away as Sumeria have that much of an impact, but a direct neighbor have zero? Even Libya should have more impact than Sumeria. But again, like I said, the rest of North Africa seems to be very different than Egypt, even though, like I said, Libya has a whole bunch of black people who live there. Again, I don't deny the Asian influence because that doesn't change it. I mean, just because you're a little bit Asian doesn't mean you're not black. So, again, if you look at these things, some of them might give you the vibes of, Egypt, but that's at best. Whereas we've got those tablets and stuff in the beginning that just look like hieroglyphics, but they look nothing like the writing system of Sumeria. The writing system of Sumeria is its own thing altogether. And why would these Sumerians abandon it without leaving a trace? Like if these Sumerians came here and they were they were bringing stuff and they brought themselves and they landed here, why not bring their writing? Why start a new one with no transfer? No transfer at all. No, like imagine if today we went to, let's say the whole world sort of, you know, started again, and we were in Egypt, and we went to, let's say, India, and then we formed a completely different language in India. You will find the old language, especially since Sumerians wrote on like clay, and most of that stuff is preserved till this day. So why isn't there even a little bit of a piece in Egypt? Why isn't there a transfer? How do you transfer the language from one place to another? How does that happen without any real evidence? Wouldn't there be a slow conversion from what they wrote in Sumeria and then what they wrote in Egypt? And remember, other places we can see a direct translation. You know, if we look at how Egypt went from Egyptian language to English today, we can see the transition. It's not lost. But if we look at the Sumerians, there's no transition. The symbols look nothing alike. So now we move on to the next one that we're talking about. So this is the main period of cultural influence, particularly consisting in transfer of Mesopotamian imagery. Like I said, that's possible. I'm not saying it's a fact because, you know, this could just be an Egyptian dude. But of cultural influence, particularly consisting in the transfer of Mesopotamian imagery, symbols. I do not see any evidence of symbols, and technology to Egypt. What technology? What technology that existed in Sumeria is found in Egypt? You can't just say something like that and leave it like that. Now, as we can see, we carry on. Designs and objects. Distinctly foreign objects and art forms entered Egypt during this period, indicating contact with several parts of Western Asia. The designs that were emulated by Egyptian artists are numerous. The Uruk priest kings, with the tunic and brimmed hat in the posture of the master and of animals, and the serpapards, winged griffins, snakes, and rosettes, boats with high prows, all characteristic of long established Mesopotamian art of the late Uruk. All of these, by the way, are, you know, loose connections, because all of this can be very simple. And of course, like I said, that master of the animals thing, that's one thing. That's not even a big deal, to be honest. The same priest king is visible in several older Mesopotamian works of art of the end of the Uruk periods, such as the Blau monuments, cylinder seal, and statues. Like I said, I don't doubt that that is a Mesopotamian thing. What I doubt, or what I'm skeptical of when I'm talking about it, is why doesn't the rest of Egypt look like that? Why does that thing look more like a Sumerian thing than anything else in Egypt that existed at the time? If you look at the way that everybody else is portrayed, they're portrayed looking like a shaved Egyptian. That guy's got a beard and he kind of, you know, he's giving a lot of, you know, Mesopotamian vibes. Objects such as the Jebel el Arak knife handle, which has patently Mesopotamian relief carvings on it, have been found in Egypt, and the silver which appears in this period can only have been obtained from Asia Minor. Okay, like there was trade between the two locations, but that doesn't mean people completely moved. It's like saying that the Kingdom of Congo was like a civilization of the Portuguese. There was a lot of trade, but you know what happened to the people that were there? Did they just kick them out? Now they claim that the pottery that's from Egypt, some of it looks like Mesopotamian pottery, and maybe it does, but let's first read. Red slip spouted pottery items dating to around 3500 BCE, which were probably used for pouring water, beer, and wine, suggest that Egypt was in contact with the and being influenced by Mesopotamia around that time. we'll come back to it. This type of pottery was manufactured in Egypt with Egyptian clay, but its shape, particularly the spout, is certainly Mesopotamian in origin. So what we have here, let's first see. Let's first pull up some images. So this is one of the most ridiculous things because clearly what we're seeing here is a variety of forms and they picking one to say, yep, that one kind of looks like a Sumerian jar. Well, what about the fact that this black topped uh, pots are actually typical of Nubia, other places in Nubia, going as far south as ever? Not to mention that the many different shapes here I could connect with so many different places in Africa. It's actually kind of ridiculous to say that because one jar kind of looks like it represents Mesopotamia, which by the way, he didn't provide that, but I'm going to go by it. That means, yeah, they were influenced by Mesopotamia. What? Most of these look very typical for Africa, to be honest. Some of them even still have the same patterns that you see all over Africa. If you look at the black ones that they put over there, the black ones clearly still have the same imagery. You look at that flat one at the top in the picture and compare it to the flat one in, first of all, the very first line where you see the black top ones. You can see the black top one looks as flat as this one. The second row, you can see it. The third row, you can see it in the very beginning of the third row. Then you can see something that looks close to it with even the same pattern in the fifth row, but third. What are we talking about? There's so many more similarities in Africa. Now, I could sit here and show you several other jars that look like these, but, you know, let's move on. Oh, yeah, before we move on, I want to state that the reason why this argument is also weak is because pottery is first found in West Africa and Nubia way before it's found in Egypt. And so there is no reason to believe that the West African pottery didn't just move from West Africa to North Africa to Egypt. There's no reason to believe that whatsoever. And we know for a fact that West African pottery, because the oldest pottery ever found in Africa is in West Africa, there's no reason to believe that it came from anywhere else. It was homemade. That means if there even was an influence of Sumerian on the pottery, the majority of the pottery in Egypt was influenced by West Africa through Central Africa and North Africa, and then to Egypt. That's the majority of the transfer of it, but how much is that spoken of? But that transfer is also something important about it because now the question becomes, okay, can you transfer a system without transferring the people? Are we going to say that the people of Egypt are West Africans? Now, given the fact that we've done DNA tests on Nubians and Ethiopians and stuff like that, and we know that there's a very sharp difference between East Africans and West Africans genetically. Obviously, they still come from the same stock, but genetically, it's probably not likely that the Egyptians were West Africans. But the transfer was there. So you can transfer an entire culture without transferring the people. Now let's carry on reading. So over there it says, which were probably used for pouring water, beer, or wine, suggests that Egypt was in contact with and being influenced by Mesopotamia around that time. In contact with, yes, influence, very small, almost non-existent. This time of pottery, also the contact part is also questioned because there's no real true, they had contact with West Asia, but that far, we don't really know. This type of pottery was manufactured in Egypt and Egyptian clay, but its shape, particularly the spout, is certainly Mesopotamian in origin. Again, eh. Such vessels were new and rare in pre-dynastic Egypt, but had been commonly manufactured in Mesopotamian cities of Nippur and Uruk for centuries. Not enough evidence. This indicates that Egyptians were familiar with Mesopotamian types of pottery. The discovery of these vessels initially encouraged the development of the dynastic race theory, according to which Mesopotamians would have established the first pharaonic line, but is now considered by many scholars to be simply indicative of cultural influence and borrowings circa 3500 BC. Although there is an established gene flow from Mesopotamia and West Asia into Egypt, no, there is no established gene flow from Mesopotamia. There's an established one from West Asia, like at the very corners, but not from Mesopotamia, as he is saying. Now, this 3500 BC thing that's about the first pharaonic line. I love that they debunk it in their own thing where they say, yes, the first pharaohs were not Mesopotamian, and nothing about them seems Mesopotamian. Nothing about any of these dudes is Mesopotamian. If you've seen the whole video so far, nothing about this is Mesopotamia. Egypt is very different than Mesopotamia in all ways. And to use jars, especially you got to use one jar overall to conclude this is it doesn't make any sense. Moving on, the adoption of the Mesopotamian style mace head. Egyptians used traditionally disc-shaped mace heads during the early phase of Naqada culture, circa 4000 to 3400 BCE. At the end of the period, the disc-shaped mace head was replaced by a military superior Mesopotamian style pear-shaped mace head. As seen on the Narmer palette, the Mesopotamian mace head was much heavier with a wider impact surface and was capable of giving much more damaging blows than the original Egyptian disc-shaped mace head. Now, given the fact that mace heads around the world are kind of pear-shaped and some of them round, it makes no sense to say that the Mace head looked like the no. I'm not buying this one. And also, to me, it's just why can't Egypt have developed these things on their own? Clearly, there was a giant change that was happening. So why didn't they just develop newer and newer ideas? Now, the next part is probably the strongest evidence that they put on this entire uh, page. It is generally thought that the cylinder seal were introduced from Mesopotamia to Egypt during the Naqada II period. Cylinder seals some coming from Mesopotamia and some Elam in ancient Iran, and some made locally in Egypt, copying earlier Mesopotamian Elamite designs in a stylized manner, have been discovered in the tomb of Upper Egypt dating to the Naqada II and III, particularly in the Hieroconpolis. Mesopotamian cylinder seals have been found in the Gerizim context of Naqada II in Naqada and Hu, attesting to the expansion of the Mesopotamian Jamida Nasser culture as far as Egypt at the end of the 4th millennium BC. Now, the reason why I say this is the strongest one is because, of course, cylinder seals are not something you just come across, and their usage as stamps and stuff like that, it's not something you just come across. And the fact that they both have them is a very curious thing. Now, I'm not saying they didn't independently discover them, but a lot of similarities are there, which to me means that there probably was some uh, sending from one to the other. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't have been independent, because um, the people, the Olmec have cylinder seals, and the Olmec have nothing to do with the Mesopotamians whatsoever. In fact, they use their cylinder seals to print on clothing. Now, the next part is probably makes the argument more, a better argument. In Egypt, cylinder seals suddenly appear without any local antecedent, and around Nakada II, second, the design are similar to and clearly inspired by the Mesopotamian, where they were invented during the early 4th millennium BCE during the Uruk period as an evolutionary step of various accounting systems the and seals going back as early as the 7th millennium BCE in Mesopotamia. The earliest Egyptian cylinder seals are clearly similar to earlier and contemporary Uruk seals down Nakada II. Now, before we go on, I want to state that a lot of the stuff that this thing is saying, is not true. It is not true that it is believed that the ancient Egyptian things, a lot of these things came from these areas. Now, like I'm saying, these cylinders definitely a lot of them were made outside of Egypt, but it is not true that the characters or any of that stuff influenced the ancient Egyptians beyond that, because we do know that from linguistics there is no true, you know, passing from one to the other. Not to mention that there was an independent accounting system in Egypt that was made from tags that were found in Egypt. And why would they go for an inferior accounting system instead of going with this cylinder seal thing that they have? Now, this is where they go from their strongest argument to the weakest argument, because, of course, they take the idea that there were stone buildings in Mesopotamia and then draw a similarity between Egypt, which most people have just dismissed this as like stupid. But let's read it quickly. Egyptian architecture also was influenced as it adopted various elements of earlier Mesopotamian temples and civil architecture. You have to prove that. Recessed niches, in particular, which are characterized of Mesopotamian temple architecture, were adopted for the design of a false door in the tombs of the first dynasty and the second dynasty from the time of the Nakada III period. Yeah, it is unknown if the transfer of this design was a result of Mesopotamian builders and architects in Egypt, or if the temple design on imported Mesopotamian seals may have been a sufficient source of inscription for Egyptian architects to manage themselves, or none of that happened and it was independently developed. The design of the ziggurat, which appeared in Mesopotamia in the late 5th millennium BC, was clearly a precursor to and an influence on the Egyptian pyramids, especially the stepped design of the oldest pyramids, the earliest of which dates to circa 2600 BCE, well over 2000 years younger than Mesopotamian ziggurat. Now, here's the problem. We know that these things are actually based off of mastabas, which was a single base thing. So they didn't they independently came up with the idea of making pyramids. Making pyramids is all over the world, and I have to quote him. Neil deGrasse Tyson said, "The reason why we see pyramids all over the world is because pyramids are some of the most stable structures out there. The Egyptians, the Sumerians, all these people, they had all kinds of shapes. To take this and go, these two shapes are the same, therefore, blah, 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 is similar. No, we find stone circles around the world. That doesn't mean everyone around the world came from the same culture. Egypt is obviously an independent nation that came up with their own rules. And of course, we'd have to find other reasons for why Egypt looks the way it does and then Sumeria looks the way it does immediately. As soon as Egypt comes up, it looks very different than Sumeria. So where are they getting all the other ideas? So they take the little things that look similar and they exaggerate them. And I promise you, they really, the snake thing doing a jive, I've seen that in many places around the world. But let's read what they say. The root of this trade is difficult to determine. Yeah, of course. But direct Egyptian contact with Canaan in the Levant does not predate the early dynastic era. There you go. So it is usually assumed to have been the sea trade during the time when the dynastic race theory was still popular. It was proposed that Mesopotamian sailors circumnavigated Arabia, but a Mediterranean route, probably by middlemen through the Canaanite, and they were just traveling, just they were just heading straight for Egypt, even though they had no idea there was a place called Egypt. Probably by middlemen through the Canaanite port of Babylos. It also likely as evidenced by the presence of Canaanite Babylonian objects in Egypt. Glyptic art also seems to have played a key role through the circulation of decorative cylindrical seals across the Levant, repeating again, a common hinterland of both empires, particularly Mesopotamia. All of that is just nonsense that I just read. Like none of this makes any sense. It's speculation at best. And of course, there is a civilization that's right next to Egypt. The intensity of the exchange suggests, however, that the contacts between Egypt and Mesopotamia were often direct rather than merely through middlemen. Good, I'm glad they said that because now they just reminded me what I wanted to say when I was going to react to this. I wanted to say that most of this stuff was probably middlemen. Most of the stuff was probably, I'm going to call them Bedouin Arab tribes that were in between Mesopotamia and Egypt, who they would get something from Sumeria or something, and they would like trade it with Egypt with no context. And the Egyptians would come and they would if they borrowed the idea, they would reshape it and then move on with it with no context. The idea that these people sailed all the way and landed in Egypt, but nowhere else in Africa. They sailed through that area, through Ethiopia, through all that place, but then they landed nowhere else. And of course, they like influenced North Africa without no. All of that does not make any sense. The intensity of exchanges suggests, however, that the contacts between Egypt and Mesopotamia were often direct rather than merely through middlemen or through trade. Uruk had known colonial outposts of as far as Habuba Kabira in modern Syria, ensuring their presence in the Levant. Numerous Uruk cylinders seals have also been found uncovered there. This is why I said the cylinder seals is one of the best evidence. They're going to keep repeating it over and over again. There have been suggestions that Uruk may have had a colonial outposts and a form of colonial presence in northern Egypt, and all of those have been dismissed. The site of Buto in particular was suggested, but it has been rejected as a possible candidate. Good. In fact, that so many Garzian sites are at the mouths of wadis, which leads to the Red Sea, may indicate some amount of trade via the Red Sea. Also, it is considered unlikely that something as complicated as recessed panel architecture could have worked its way into Egypt by proxy. Thank God that someone has sense, and a possibly significant contingent of Mesopotamian migrants or settler is often suspected. So I think somebody of sense came and wrote this part of Wikipedia because, yes, that thing of saying that a bunch of Mesopotamians came from Mesopotamia and landed somewhere in Egypt and then started everything, and almost everything that they're talking about seems at best to be a coincidence. I mean, come on. Come on. And of course, the one way thing. It's like, how do you know it's one way? Where are you getting that from? And this is why I brought up all these other places. If we look at the Polynesians, even that is not one way. You don't see people doing this thing of having it one. And also, why would it be one way? Once the Sumerians had discovered Egypt, what would make them stop going? These early contacts probably acted as a sort of catalyst for the development of Egyptian culture, particularly in the respect of inception of writing. That is not supported by 99% of evidence. The codification of royal and vernacular imagery and architectural innovations. So this is why you can't always trust Wikipedia. This is all nonsense again. And by the way, this isn't like me saying this. This is most Egyptologists, most people do not believe this at all. And now we deal with a section that talks about the influence of the locals of Egypt, meaning that somebody's pushing back on it even in here. While there's clear evidence that Nakada II culture borrowed abundantly from Mesopotamia, there is also a commonly held view that many of the achievements of the later First Dynasty were also a result of a long period of indigenous cultural and political development. Such developments are much older than the Nakada II period. There we go, preach. The Nakada II period had a large degree of continuity with Nakada I period, and the changes which had happened during the Nakada periods happened over a significant amount of time. Although there are many examples of Mesopotamian influence in Egypt in the 4th millennium BCE, the reverse is not true, and there are no traces of Egyptian influence in Mesopotamia at the time, clearly indicating a one way flow of ideas. Only very few Egyptian Nakada period objects have been found beyond Egypt and generally in its vicinity, such as the rare Nakada III Egyptian cosmetic palette in the shape of a fish, and the end of the 4th millennium BCE found in Ashkelon or Gaza. Early Egyptologists, such as Flinders Petrie, were proponents of the dynastic race theory, which hypothesized that the first Egyptian chieftains and rulers were themselves of Mesopotamian origin, but this view has been abandoned among modern scholars. The current position of modern scholarship is that the Egyptians' civilization was an indigenous Nile Valley development and that the archaeological evidence strongly supports an African origin of the ancient Egyptians. Wonderful. And again, I'm not denying that through a middleman, there were items that came through from the areas of Sumeria and they went through. You see, there where it said a lot of Egyptian items stopped at Gaza. I believe that's because those middlemen were trading these items with those people, and in return, they got those things that those middlemen in Gaza got. It's not that hard. It's actually not that hard to do. By the way, I'm still reading the same Wikipedia thing. That wasn't me showing a debunking or something. That was the same article, and so some people were obviously pushing back. So even in this article, you can see that they are saying exactly what I'm saying, which is that the strongest evidence suggests an African influence. And of course, like I said, this the whole part in the beginning does not address the African influence. It doesn't talk about, okay, so pottery came from Africa, circumcision came from Africa, this came from Africa, that came from Africa, blah came from Africa. It doesn't talk about all of those things that you don't really see in Sumeria. Now I started this by talking about writing, and they finish off with writing, which is important. It is generally thought that Egyptian hieroglyphs came into existence a century or so after Sumerian script and were probably invented under the influence of the latter, probably. And I'm glad they put quotation marks there. And that it is probable that the general idea of expressing words of a language in writing was brought to Egypt from Sumeria and Mesopotamia. The two writing systems are in fact quite similar in their initial stages, relying heavily on pictographs forms and then evolving a parallel system of expression of phonetic sounds. Now, I will easily tell you that um, most Sumerian and Mesopotamian writers don't believe this. They look at the symbols and they go, "There's no similarities between the two." But I also want to show you because they're saying, "Oh, they started both as pictographs." The reason why I put that first map in the beginning is to show you that this does not count as a similarity. That's like saying that a language is similar because they both use words. All writing, no matter how far away and had nothing to do with Sumeria, starts off as pictures. All of them. So to say that that's a similarity and then, oh, then later they have a phonetic expression, that's no. And also, not to mention that the phonetic expressions they don't look the same. If you've ever looked at Mesopotamian A to their letters, they do not look anything like the ones in Egypt. And also, the words are nothing the same. Like I said, Sumerian is a language isolate. People know how to actually speak it. And then Egyptian is an Afro-Asiatic language. And so the question would be, why is it that only this one Semitic branch, if it's Semitic, would come in, but everything else would stay back, including the Mesopotamian languages? So we continue reading. Standard reconstructions of the development of writing generally place the development of Sumerian proto-cuneiform script before the development of Egyptian hieroglyphs, with a strong suggestion of the Floma influencing the latter. Not true. There is, however, a lack of direct evidence that Mesopotamian writing influenced Egyptian form, and no definite determination has been made as to the origin of hieroglyphics in ancient Egypt. Some scholars point out that a very credible argument can also be made for the independent development of writing in Egypt. Since the 1990s, the discovery of glyphs on clay tags at Abydos dated to between 3400 and 3200 BCE may challenge the classical notion according to which the Mesopotamian symbols system predates the Egyptian one. Although perhaps tellingly, Egyptian writing does not make a sudden appearance at the time with no antecedents or precursors, while, on the contrary, Mesopotamian already had a long evolutionary history of sign usage in token dating back to circa 8000 BCE, followed by proto-cuneiform. Pittman proposes that the Abydos clay tags are almost identical to contemporary clay tags from Uruk, which is not true. Egyptian scholar Gamal Mokhtar argued that the invention or inventory of hieroglyph symbols derived from fauna and flora used in the signs are essentially African, and in regards to writing, we have seen that a purely Nilotic, hence African origin, not only is not excluded, but probably reflects the reality. Although he acknowledged the geographical location of Egypt made it a receptacle for many influences. According to Frank Yuko, Egyptian Egyptian writing arose in Akkadian Upper Egypt and A group Nubia, and not in the Delta cultures, where the direct Western Asian contact was made. Further vitiates the Mesopotamian influence argument. Now we can see here they're going to talk about the Egyptian influence on Mesopotamian art, which again probably existed, but let's just read it for a while. After this early period of exchange and the direct introduction of Mesopotamian components into Egyptian culture, Egypt soon asserted its own style on early dynastic period, the Narmer palette being seen as the turning point. Egypt seems to have provided some artistic feedback to Mesopotamia at the time of the early dynastic period of Mesopotamia. This is especially the case with the royal iconography the figure of the king smiting his enemies with a mace and the depiction of dead enemies being eaten by birds of prey appeared in Egypt from the time of the Narmer and were then adopted centuries later, possibly from Egypt, by Mesopotamian rulers Akhenaten and Sargon of Akkad. This depiction appears to be part of an artistic system to promote hegemonistic kingship. Another example is the usage of decorative mace heads as a symbol of kingship. Now, this flies in the face of the idea that the mace head that is that shape it came from Mesopotamia. Instead, it seems like the Mesopotamians, and I'm not saying they didn't have it before, the Mesopotamians were highly influenced by the Egyptians more than the Egyptians were by the Mesopotamians in a more direct way. And again, I'm not even saying that it was direct. And also look at the difference in the way they portray themselves. Look at Narmer and then look at the Sumerian king. Clearly, these guys do not think they look alike. There is also a possibility that the depictions of the Mesopotamian king with a muscular naked upper body fighting his enemies in the quadrangular posture as seen in the stele of Naram Sin or statue of Gadar were derived from Egyptian sculpture, which by the time had already been through its golden age during the Old Kingdom. Yeah, possibilities, possibilities. But again, that's a truly African thing, and you'll see that Sumerians don't tend to be as naked as the Egyptians. The Egyptians seem to be just as bare as the rest of Africa, which again, just another African connection, and of course, again, their neighbors are the Nubians. So this drawing similarities with Sumeria is desperate at best. And I don't even draw the other way because some people say the Egyptians influenced the Sumerians this heavy way. No, they didn't. The Sumerians clearly had a very long history that predates some of these things, but while they predated it, there were other places in Africa that predate Egypt that gave birth to Egypt, like the clay thing that I was talking about that they pass on, like cattle culture, like so many other things that they pass on to Egypt. Now, later periods have true influences and true conversion of not conversion but of a true showing that some human beings did settle. How many? Very few, but it does show that there were people who did settle in certain places, like Egyptians settling in um, the east and some eastern people settling in the west, not just Egypt, Europe, and other places as well. I mean, we know with Xerxes and all these people, they brought a large number of people, and they are talked about in how many people they brought. I mean, it's written down. Now, the scary part about this is, and I'm not going to read the rest of this, but the scary part about this is think about what that means. Sumeria had writing. Why don't they write about Egypt? Why don't we know exactly where Egypt is? We have no idea where Egypt is based on Sumerian texts. Doesn't seem that important of a place. We know where a lot of other places are. We know where Elam is. We know where all these other places are because they state, okay, this is our map and this is where this is where that is, this is where this is. Egypt's not on that map. This is a ninth century BC world map by the Babylonians, and on this they point to several directions. And these pointers, you can, if you notice, you'll notice that this map looks very similar to the later Islamic maps that would happen. But this map points to several directions, and the directions they're pointing to are several points which are considered part of the whole world. In there, there's Elam, there's the Indus Valley, there's all these civilizations that were around. Guess what's not on here? Egypt or Africa. Why? This was meant to show the world. So, in conclusion, we can see that almost every claim that was made here was wishful thinking, and the ones that were correct about, they weren't even fully correct because they were trying to make the claim way stronger than it is. And I remember I did a video on how, like, unlike other people, I don't deny that the Sumerians were Middle Eastern. They probably look like how Middle Easterners look today. Probably a little darker, but they probably look like how Middle Eastern people look today. But I don't doubt that. Look at that. I don't doubt that uh, the ancient Egyptians moved into Asia. But this is why, and into Gaza. But this is why we say that there's a strong African influence on Israel. There's a strong African influence. People go, no, no Africans ever went to the Middle East. Yeah, they did. So there you go. But speculation is weird. That whole thing we read was nonsense, and it was wishful thinking. I'm glad there were some people pushing back on it, and they said exactly what I was gonna say, just faster. It's easy. There, 90% of Egypt, 99% of Egypt was formed by a native culture slowly and slowly and slowly. There are some things that came from outside. But like I said, if you look at those things, they happen once in that specific time and they don't carry on. Everything else that carries on in Egypt is very far away from anything that's happening in Mesopotamia. That sounds like a trade good to me. It's like if we found, right, a in Japan we found a kente cloth. We can't say, oh, we found a kente cloth, therefore West Africa started the Japanese empire. Well, we found this one item. Now, if we found that item and then they keep wearing it over and over again, and they call it the same name and everything, it's like, it's more evidence. It doesn't work like this. You can't just take trade goods and then say there's no. By the way, I love how they gave no evidence for anything. Like there was no proof that if there was a middleman. The hell, where you get that from? Why you say that? There was nobody wrote why they said that. Why they showed that there was no middleman. Clearly, there was a middleman.